Andres, thank you so much for coming to our show. We are absolutely super excited to have you on. So much of what we do at Eleusinia Retreat and even the language that we use is based on the language that you use in your work. Can you tell the audience a little bit about who you are and the work that you do?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here, and very looking forward to knowing essentially how the retreat is going, and no, like seeing it in practice. It's amazing. So I'm Andres. I'm one of the co-founders of the Qualia Research Institute, which is a nonprofit that seeks to elucidate the mathematical structure of consciousness. So, I mean, essentially, we make the bold assumption that like any given experience actually corresponds to some kind of mathematical object, and then the mathematical features of that object describe the properties of the experience. And so we hypothesize various kinds of mathematical objects and investigate these possible properties, and with a special emphasis on figuring out, ultimately what makes an experience feel good or bad, with potential ultimately humanitarian applications. But along the way, we have identified neglected avenues for tackling extreme pain, as well as very promising therapeutics for potentially allowing us to experience peak experiences in a healthy and sustainable way. So that's also something that we're quite interested in. And in general, like mapping out the state space of consciousness, understanding essentially what are the properties of radically alien states of consciousness, and can they be useful for anything. All of that is things that we are very interested in at the Qualia Research Institute.
I saw your Miami TEDx talk. It was so amazing. So how did you find a passion? It feels like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. I mean, I have so many questions about what you just described, but we have to slow it down a bit. And can you tell us how you found your way to this work?
Oh my goodness. I think I actually found it through philosophy. I mean, first of all, just being very, very curious about the nature of reality, being a very philosophical kid. I mean, first I went through math and physics and approaching the mystery of reality that way. But then when I was a teenager, I realized that, hey, actually, consciousness is way more mysterious than physics, at least today. And we really have no good, theory for like what makes a brain conscious. Why are we not all philosophical zombies? And so I decided to study cognitive science. And, at the time, I became quite interested in essentially this field that is called transhumanism. Broadly speaking, I was very interested in the following three kind of like supers, which is how do we develop super longevity? How do we, stop aging? The second one is super intelligence. What is super intelligence, and can we create it? Should we create it? And then the third one is super happiness, which ultimately has become my focus and my main interest. Essentially, what are the conditions for happiness in a nervous system? What about happiness outliers, and also like, how do we reduce extreme suffering, which is something pretty obviously very related to the work that you both do. um
So my question about the mathematical design of consciousness. Now, this other people had these theories before your institute research center kind of created its own, or were you guys the first to really take it there?
yeah, it's a great question. So I would say that we are kind of, I mean, we're definitely unique in many ways. We're kind of like a confluence of various theories in addition to novel ideas that we generated. The confluence, I don't think that it could have happened earlier. When QRI was created, was still, like, I would say, early days of integrated information theory by Giulio Tononi, and there's other people working in that area. So essentially, I would describe them as some of the people who introduced the idea of a formalism for consciousness, that like, every actual experience corresponds to a mathematical object, and they take that very seriously. Ultimately, we have disagreements about the actual mathematics of integrated information theory, or whether it makes sense to think of it at kind of the information layer or information level of analysis. There's a whole rabbit hole. But the point is that, yeah, there was some, I guess, kind of like adjacent ideas, you could say, that seeded the way in which we think. But then to actually kind of make the additional claim that, hey, hold on, the thing that probably matters for whether an experience feels good or bad is the structure of the experience, as opposed to what the experience is about. That, I would say, is definitely a very unique kind of a QRI move that we presented. And as far as I know, we are the only people really kind of looking at it from that angle, which is called valence structuralism. The term was coined by my co-founder, Mike Johnson. And that angle in particular, I would say, yeah, it's definitely unique to QRI.
We love that. Can you break that down for us and help the audience understand what that means
Yes,
a little
yes.
bit more?
So, I mean, first of all, if you ask a neuroscientist what makes an experience feel good or bad, they will usually bring up topics such as what is the amount of dopamine in your nervous system or amount of serotonin and things like that. But ultimately, that is upstream. I mean, essentially, serotonin or dopamine are going to be modulating neural activity. But then the thing that actually matters is the neural activity that results. The way to modulate it is kind of incidental. And so there's this concept of a double dissociation in psychology and neuroscience, where essentially, if you want to show that a particular feature of biology or physics doesn't actually cause what it's usually thought of as causing, what you can do is essentially find situations where the feature is present but the cause is not present, and also situations where the cause is present, sorry, the effect is present but the cause is not. So here's one thing that is definitely the case, which is that you can have a lot of opioids in the nervous system and not feel good. So essentially you can inject opioids in particular parts of the brain that actually feel dysphoric. So that's just one example of why the neurotransmitters is actually not where the emotion is, right? The emotion is downstream. It's just kind of a effect. Several stages happen given the trigger of the neurotransmitters, and then down the line it makes you feel in a certain way or another. And the way we think of it at QRI is that essentially the nervous system is sort of like a musical instrument, and essentially it has consonant and dissonant modes of organization. And the thing that makes an experience feel good or bad is whether the way in which it's resonating, it's actually consonant versus dissonant. And it's a very different way of thinking about it than, let's say, serotonin or dopamine, because here you could potentially have a nervous system that is very depleted in dopamine, but it's nonetheless behaving in a very consonant way. Except, again, there are going to be strong correlations here that usually that's not going to be the case.
That is incredible. Okay. Do you want to, for the audience, define valence the way you understand it?
Yeah. So it's like the overarching way in which your experience feels. And a very important concept here is exotic valence. So, I mean, common positive valence are things such as like eating ice cream or something like that. And it's like, yeah, if you eat vanilla ice cream, overwhelmingly most people will find it like pleasant. Like, okay, this is a very nice taste. It's very sugary. That would be a standard, typical human positive valence experience. But then, relevant to this podcast, you can take something like magic mushrooms and then have your visual field have these crazy geometrical structures. And for some reason, some of those structures feel really good, and some of those they don't. And so those would be what I would describe as exotic valence, which is that you're finding a gradient from good patterns to bad patterns in a context that is completely unusual for humans to experience something feel good or bad, right? But there is that gradient, right? There's kind of sublime geometries, and then there's kind of really uncomfortable geometries. And why is that the case? Why does this gradient exist? And that is the sort of thing that we think valence structuralism can explain. To a first approximation, when a hallucination or a feeling feels bad, you will always be able to find the reason why it feels bad, and it will be something of the sort of there is dissonance between the resonant modes of this structure of experience, and essentially very unpleasant qualia will have that effect in general. And that is kind of like a weird claim that we make, but as far as we know, yeah, we haven't found any counterexample to it.
That's so interesting. Can you translate that into everyday experiences for people as well?
Yeah. So to a first approximation, the more smooth and regular and symmetrical your experience is, the more pleasant it is. And essentially, in our theory, this is true at every point in time. But essentially, the degree to which this is true is pretty extreme in that you can find very small gradients in just how smooth your experience is, and it will still track, how good or bad it feels. So essentially, let's say you're paying attention to music and you're really wrapped up in music, you will notice that oftentimes the moments of maximum enjoyment are actually during the chorus, where like kind of the music is actually repeating in a very pleasant way. But the chorus cannot last too long because then you get bored. And the thing with boredom is that it's kind of this additional kind of dissonance that is being added to your experience. So if we didn't get bored, then actually a very symmetrical art would be really, really pleasant forever. So you could be at a monastery and just be chanting a very simple mantra all day long and never get bored. And actually, I mean, to a large extent, monks who do that have hacked the nervous system so that it doesn't get bored anymore. And that's perfectly fine. That's, I think, like that's a one way of actually being in a high valence positive experience. I don't have any issues with it. But in general, most people will experience a boredom mechanism come up, which will actually make the experience kind of stuffy and dissonant in and of itself. But then there's also, for example, in meditation, that something you can easily do is try to do nothing for a couple minutes, and then you will notice that the discomfort that you have, whether it is a craving or a fear, or let's say something, some bad interaction we had with somebody, it will always manifest as some kind of pinching or shearing or pressure or tension in your felt sense of your body. Like a craving, for example, there is no craving without some kind of contortion in your sense of your body. They always come hand in hand. And actually, to a large extent, like a way of relieving a craving is actually to kind of pay attention to the way in which it feels in the body and try to undo it there, as opposed to try to tackle the craving directly. And
If you tackle the craving, does that create the symmetry, the
yeah,
the dissonance and then the symmetry with fulfilling that craving? Is that symmetry?
yes. So exactly that you could definitely tackle it that way. You could tackle the craving directly on your felt sense of your body by kind of undoing the distortion or undoing the contortion. And I think that's obviously even better because then you don't reinforce the craving. But either way, I mean, the moment you satisfy the craving, you will notice that there's a release of tension. And that is, one of the key ways in which valence manifests is how tensed up, how contorted is your bodily sense of self. And all of that has to do essentially with the structure of the experience, how tense versus how smooth or how symmetrical the experience is. Whereas, yeah, I mean, if you're really deep in meditation in a very, very positive space, you will notice that essentially waves of energy can move across your sense of your body with no resistance. And that is essentially a very positive, very pleasant, harmonious state of being. And it's the sort of thing that you can experience with a very, healing, re-annealing session to reboot that kind of clean nervous system where all the harmonies essentially work without resistance.
So emotions, you said, are downstream from our neurotransmitters.
Mhm.
So therefore, the neurotransmitters start it, and that's the cascade to produce the dissonance or the symmetry, the valence at that point. That's where the math comes in and is in that cascade from neurotransmitters to emotions.
Not exactly. So when I say that, yeah, neurotransmitters are upstream, in a sense, what I mean is that there could be other things that could also cause it. So, for example, we predict that the pleasure that you experience from activating the pleasure centers, which essentially, yeah, okay, this internal feeling of harmony or something like that, you could reproduce the same feeling by just essentially stimulating the rest of the brain in a harmonious way without actually touching the pleasure centers. So the math really is being applied to the actual experience, the moment in which it happens, as opposed to what was the process that led to it. So there's like peaks of valence, and there's a number of them. But yeah, man, one of them is ecstatic seizures, like Dostoevsky used to have. He would have an epileptic seizure, and right before it, he would have this profound sense of harmony, and everything is perfect. And I think he even said something like he would trade a few seconds of those moments of harmony for 10 years of his life because of just how how amazing they were. Everything seems perfect in those moments. That's the sort of thing where, in principle, according to our theory, if you have this really smooth but highly energized symmetrically repeating pattern in the electromagnetic field, and that is actually overlaying your experience. That might be extremely pleasant, might be a really wonderful experience. And we see this also with other things. I mean, the Janus is the other case. These are these very advanced concentration states. And the reason we are so fascinated by them at QRI is that they're all described as like very simple but highly energized. So attention becomes very smooth, whether it's peripheral or central attention. And then in the higher jhanas, you actually have what's called formless states of consciousness, absorption into pure space or pure consciousness or nothingness. That's like close to zero information. I mean, there's very little going on, but people describe them as very refreshing and rejuvenating, and just overall like a lot of well-being in those states. Um, and finally, the other one that is like really relevant for us is 5-MeO DMT experiences, which is the ones that are catalyzed by the toad. But essentially, yeah, these drugs, especially that one, it
Why
produces like,
one and not the regular DMT?
yeah, because the phenomenology is very, very different. So regular DMT produces what we call competing clusters of coherence. So essentially, you'll have kind of these big bubbles of resonance that are kind of like in an evolutionary process. And there's a lot of complexity on a typical DMT trip. And that, from the point of view of valence, is going to be very mixed. I mean, essentially, it's kind of an orchestra where some of the instruments are in tune with each other, some of them are not. And all of that produces consonance and dissonance at the same time. Very mixed experience, very rich. It's kind of like a Shostakovich or Rachmaninoff piece. It's this very complex, convoluted thing that it's always on the brink of disaster, but sometimes it's very beautiful. Whereas 5-MeO DMT is very simple. I mean, it oftentimes is kind of like just this wave of pure space and like the most clean space possible and just no content other than space and silence is one possible 5-MeO DMT experience. And that is much more related to kind of pure joy or pure happiness because it doesn't have all these crazy complexity opportunities for consonance and dissonance. Uh,
Wow. Okay, so one of the things I loved about your TEDx talk is how you were talking about how because I'm a nurse, a nursing background, and I came from PACU for many years. So we worked with anesthesia. So you're talking about the invention of anesthesia was so
yeah.
monumental to science. But at first, when people were bringing the idea of anesthesia for surgery, everybody just poo-pooed them. And, basically it got nowhere. And you took that analogy to psychedelics and to what we could do for pain. Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Yes, I think my claim is that anesthesia was monumental. I mean, it was a breakthrough in how we tackle many kinds of suffering. I think that right now there are things that are as impactful as anesthesia, but currently being neglected, and they just don't seem like credible medical interventions. And I mean, there's a number of them. It's not just one of them, but very related to obviously what you're very interested in. Classic psychedelics like psilocybin and DMT for things like cluster headaches. I think if you run the numbers, chances are there's as many people having cluster headache right now as people undergoing a surgery. So like I don't think it is, or rather, I'm pretty convinced that in terms of raw numbers, actually giving DMT vape pens to every household would actually reduce suffering as much, if not more, than anesthesia was for surgery.
That is so amazing. So, I've been a nurse for 15 years and I've given lots of traditional narcotics for pain and huge amounts with all sorts of side effects and all sorts of trouble that I heard you talk about on multiple talks that you did. But being with Eleusinia and watching how DMT can really interrupt a pain cycle, that was like, for me, I love the way you rate pain because it's a lot more complicated than the traditional nursing scale of on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is your pain? So that's the scale that I'm talking about. I would see pain so severe of a 9 with incredible agitation, restlessness, nausea, vomiting. And after the DMT experience, having it 100% eradicated with no residual side effect, with the person being 100% functional for the rest of the day. And as a nurse, I've never seen anything do that. Have
Yeah,
you have you seen it?
I have not seen it in action. I mean, I've just interviewed a couple dozen people with this experience. I mean, we were very interested, especially on DMT, because of how fast it acts.
Because it wouldn't matter if LSD or even psilocybin work just as well. I mean, your day is shot. So
That's
adding
right.
DMT, or it's going to be a different kind of day. Let's just say it's going to be a very different day.
Yes.
But
Yes.
the DMT, that's just a few minutes, and then you can move on.
And
Yeah.
the retreat is so amazing because we have, of course, a lot of people specifically for chronic pain, but their spouses come too. So we have this dynamic retreat that will support all sorts of people going through all sorts of stuff, and it's not just specialized in chronic pain. We have depression, anxiety, body dysmorphia, and then all
Wow.
sorts of different things with pain, phantom limb pain, all sorts of things. So it's marvelous, and it's marvelous to have a focus on chronic pain because nobody else is doing it. So your work means so much to us. So you
Yeah.
gave us this theory about psychedelics, everybody having a DMT. I mean, obviously that would be amazing, but the human component is that people are very afraid
Yeah.
of entering into that. But do you have any other ideas or beliefs that if we had this as a household items, we would lose
Yeah.
some other great suffering?
Yeah. I mean, I think like with respect to DMT, I mean, I think like a setup where essentially you can get like maybe up to like 3 milligrams per like toke or something like that, and maybe even like a maximum of 3 milligrams every 5 minutes or something like that, so that like even if you wanted to hallucinate, you wouldn't be able to. But if you're experiencing cluster headache, you can like take another hit every 5 minutes, and then over the course of 20 minutes or something would probably subside. But I mean, then again, we should definitely see if that actually works as a strategy. But yeah.
Yeah, actually, from the vape pens that we have used, I find it's actually a little bit difficult for someone to get a full dose out of a vape pen.
Oh,
They
I
actually
see.
have
Yeah.
to work for it a little bit. It takes several puffs within a period of time. And I find myself in a very strange situation of having to teach someone who's old enough, that could be my mother, or even with a little bit of stretch, a grandmother, how to smoke, which is a unique experience because it takes a little bit of practice, a little bit of training for someone who's never smoked anything before.
Yeah. No, it sounds like a ride. Yeah. So that's, I mean, the other advancement definitely, I think, is going to be like non-psychoactive versions of something like DMT, but that also reduce cluster headaches. But then beyond that, other things that I often talk about, it's, I mean, to me, like one of the biggest revolutions that there will be in terms of like pain management, probably by a long shot, is going to be this concept of anti-tolerance pharmaceuticals more broadly, with a leading example to us being Ibogaine. I mean, and here's the thing, right? Like, if you look at kind of what is the culture in kind of like psychedelic spaces, oftentimes you will find like this very strong, you can describe it as like opioid phobia, or in general actually like phobia towards like the pharma industry more generally, right? It's kind of this idea of like, well, they're they're selling you antidepressants, and they'll calcifying your pineal glands. So there's like a lot of tropes and memes like that in psychedelic spaces. So it's kind of this ideology of, I mean, essentially just like, if you have chronic pain or something like that, then you maybe you just need weed or something like that. But then
I also want the rest of my day. That's the problem. And I want the rest of my day back. It's not just, okay, let's put out this fire. It's like I want to actually do things,
yeah
not just be stuck in a twilight zone all the time.
yeah, exactly. And my understanding, I mean, essentially, is that for many kinds of chronic pain, really the only thing that works is opioids, like morphine or oxycontin, or like, yeah, I mean, you're a nurse, so like, I mean, there's kind of like a reality check with people who actually interact with people with chronic pain. um
Yeah, and in the
so
hospital, when I have somebody in chronic pain or an intense headache, when I'm in that setting, and I cannot say, "Have you tried DMT?" It's 100% at this point in time, completely not allowed.
yeah, or weed edibles, right?
In the state, right? Are you in the legal states? Are you allowed to suggest that weed edibles?
I don't think so. Even in a legal state, that it's just Western medicine. It depends. I'm sure very few nurses would be able to.
So essentially, I think like in this whole kind of like class of situations, the thing that is the most exciting would be a drug that allows you to essentially have the relief of a opioid painkiller, but without your body getting used to the painkiller. I mean, it's the holy grail. And Ibogaine, it's amazing because it really does that. The only problem is that it also makes you hallucinate and also might be mildly cardiotoxic. But I mean, it's a question like whether microdoses are really a concern, and it's
Mhm.
possible that they're not. But the most exciting kind of like case reports to me are people with severe chronic pain who, they take morphine every day, they have like for 10 years and there's no way around it. But then they start taking small doses of Ibogaine, and then all of a sudden, over the course of a month or something, they can cut down their dose of opioids by like 90% and still get the same pain relief. But then all of a sudden they're also able to, like do a lot more in their day because they're not like completely sedated in bed, all day long. So
Sedated.
So you talked about, the side effects being possible cardiotoxicity, which I understand that, but some people are really finding a lot of meaning in the ability to hallucinate. Where is your stance and understanding with that?
yeah. I mean, I think in the ideal world we just disentangle them. I mean, like I think like Ibogaine trips, I think, are like really, really fascinating. I mean, I haven't tried Ibogaine myself, but like people I know who are like psychonauts who've tried, everything, they say Ibogaine is really special too. And like, obviously, as somebody who's interested in investigating consciousness,
30 hours, right? Or is that
it's
a
like yeah, it's the same thing. It's a long, long trip essentially. And I mean, I'm sure like it will be very relevant for science, but I think essentially the reason why people are very comfortable with the idea of like, yeah, Ibogaine comes with this hallucination and that's just part of the deal, is that they're usually thinking in terms of like, how do we treat a junkie? How do we treat somebody who's in the streets on heroin? And there's kind of like this moralistic component. Like, yeah, that person needs to face their demons and they need to realize, they betrayed their family and culture or something like that. Whereas I think like let's dissociate this. One thing is, chronic pain, which is like we have to tackle it biochemically. And then a different thing is gonna be like addiction. And but even within addiction, we should still dissociate like the anti-tolerance effect, which you can get with small doses. And yeah, the hallucinatory component, which I think should be voluntary. And it should essentially be more towards people who are interested in investigating consciousness than people who are suffering essentially for, whether
Wow.
it's caused by themselves or not. I mean, I think it doesn't matter.
So at one point in time, you're saying we'll have that option. Hopefully we don't lose that option because to some people it's very valuable, but to
Yeah.
others it should be their choice. That's very fascinating. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, and I think like the big revolution is going to be with ibogaine like compounds that are completely non-psychoactive, but they reverse tolerance. And I think like that, I mean, in 20 years or 30 years, I think it's just going to be like standard of care that like, yeah, if you suffer from chronic pain, they will always combine an opioid together with one of these anti-tolerance drugs is what I suspect is going to be the case.
For hemicrania continua or cluster headaches, opioids don't work.
Yeah.
That doesn't work at all. I mean, even for a lot of neuropathy, it just doesn't touch it. It doesn't have any impact at all.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just too extreme. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
no. Okay. So hemicrania continua is not super extreme. It's just persistent. All
Hmm.
the trigeminal autonomic cephalalgias, they're organized by their intensity and by their frequency. The hemicrania continua, the one that I have, is constant all the time and low level. While cluster headaches are separated into attacks that happen usually at the same time each day or the same time each year, hemicrania continua is much not super intense, but it's like the Chinese torture versus being flayed alive. It's a drip, drip, drip of
Yeah.
constant pain.
I see. Yeah, so just the type of pain.
So we're talking about, hallucinogens, psilocybin and DMT, and we haven't really got into the details of psilocybin because psilocybin has this unique anti-inflammatory effect as well. Do you have any insight into psilocybin?
There's definitely like two or three applications or relevances here. I mean, at QRI, kind of like the three goals that we have is reduce negative extremes, which is what we have talked about mostly today. Then also is improve baseline. How do we actually bring somebody who's feeling okay or feeling kind of like neutral to like, you know, like every day feels pretty good, like a decent experience. And then like achieving new heights, which is like investigating like really positive peaks of experience. And I mean, psilocybin for kind of like reducing inflammation, to me, it slots into essentially increasing baseline. That like, yeah, I mean, for a lot of people, mild levels of chronic inflammation is something that prevents them from living their best life. But most of the things in that context that I could talk about is kind of like annealing in general as essentially a way of reducing internal friction. And like this may actually happen further than just the central nervous system. I mean, to the extent that there's so many other processes in our body that, yeah, I mean, essentially can benefit from a neural annealing session, I think. And yeah, essentially, a very key concept here is this concept called impedance matching, which is essentially how easy it is for two resonators or two metronomes, two parts of your nervous system that are essentially creating like particular frequencies, for them to sync up. And in general, on psychedelics, the impedance matching increases, meaning that parts of your nervous system that are kind of like actually resonating in their own frequencies and in their own way on something like psilocybin, they're able to actually sync up and exchange information. And I think like that process essentially kind of like reducing internal boundaries and allowing the free flow of information within the nervous system. Yeah, I mean, essentially kind of reintegrate parts of your body that have long been isolated. And yeah, there's kind of this very embodied feeling of actually they're part of me again. And yeah, I mean, I think like within the increasing baseline, that type of effect is really promising to investigate.
Would you mind backing up and giving the audience a definition of neural annealing? We do talk about neural annealing at the retreat, but I'd love to hear a definition from you.
Yeah. So, okay, so to a first approximation, this is a combination of two things. So, first of all, you need the symmetry theory of valence as kind of like an underlying background assumption that like more positive states of consciousness in general will be the ones that are more symmetrical, smooth, lacking in internal tension. And then the other very important element is this concept of an energy parameter, that essentially at any given point in time, there is a degree to which you're activated or degree to which you're conscious. And essentially things like psilocybin and DMT, LSD, in a dose dependent way, they influence the energy parameter. So if you take psilocybin, literally, you know, you could say that you're energized. Why? Because you know, if you compute the total amount of energy of your experiences, you know, the sum of the intensity of your visual field and the intensity of your tactile field and the intensity of your emotions, you add all of that together on psilocybin, you will get like a higher score essentially. And one observation is that essentially when you're like activated in an energized state of consciousness, things are actually kind of like more soft and malleable and melty. And this concept is called entropic disintegration. It's from Robin Carhart Harris, a famous neuroscientist who's currently doing a lot of psychedelic research, where essentially they find that patterns of neural activity essentially like break down. Essentially, the brain is too heated up, so they actually stop crystallizing in the common way in which they do. So you have kind of this window of opportunity where they're broken up, they are fragmented out, and then as you cool down, as you essentially come down, it's an opportunity for them to essentially cool down in a way that is more harmonious, in a way that is more symmetrical and smooth. Phenomenologically, the way in which that will manifest, essentially parts of your experience actually getting in sync with each other and kind of like having this ability, like being in tune with one another. Like maybe before there was an internal boundary, they were not in speaking terms. After the neural annealing session, you're more integrated. And yeah, I mean, if you were to do this over and over, especially combined with meditation, is a sort of thing that, yeah, in principle, increase the degree of concentration to which your nervous system is capable of, which is, yeah, the sort of thing that, at least from interviews, we seem to observe it on a lot of practitioners.
So we can be at a state where we can learn easier and we're more creative and we just have a higher standard of quality of life and on and on and on once we move through that process.
Yeah, and we can heal our internal traumas. I mean, to a large extent, like internal traumas are kind of these inner tensions or like inner stresses that are left from past experiences. And yeah, during a psychedelic experience, you can undo that stress or process it, or because of impedance matching, these very weird effects that people report where it feels like I processed the trauma of my grandmother dying, for example, with my kidney or with my leg or something very weird. It's kind of like, oh, this part of my body was able to untangle or undo a knot that was in this other part of my body, because in that state of consciousness, essentially your whole nervous system is more interconnected. So like one part of your nervous system can work on the problems of a different part of the nervous system, and then yeah, as you cool down, that stays the same. I mean, actually you did work it out.
That is absolutely fascinating. That is so incredible.
DMT is a little bit different because DMT, its attractor state is these competing clusters of coherence, so it actually doesn't anneal you in the same way as like mushrooms can. DMT actually is going to complexify your experience more and more the more you take it, because you get these really strong impressions of really complex information states, essentially. Like, and oftentimes they're full of narrative too. It's kind of like, oh, I was taken to a spaceship and they were giving the secrets of the universe, and they're very specific, you know, and and George Bush is involved somehow. Like there's like these very specific things.
You see, that's
So
funny. That has not been my experience of DMT. I've experienced
okay.
very low information.
But is this
Even-
a difference between 5-MeO and then regular DMT?
I think you're talking about NDMT,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And so you're
Okay.
saying you don't experience these complex narratives and
No,
complex...
I mean, yes, I do experience like complex geometry, but as far as narratives or entities, I just don't think that my brain works that way.
Okay.
I mean, because I've seen these very complicated things that, and when someone describes to me what they think, okay, what a DMT elf is or what these entities are, it looks sort of similar, but I don't think I've never really placed this label of entity. That's it.
I got to share something. So I'm always looking, like, is there an angel? Like I've had a DMT experience and I'm like looking for an angel. And the message that I've got multiple times was, you are the angel.
Yeah.
So there is a narrative there.
Super embarrassing, but you know.
No, I've heard that too. Also, that I've heard that.
Tanya,
reported.
you're our angel. You're our angel.
Well, I'm about to go work at his institute because this has been such a fascinating experience.
Wait, no, we can't lose you. What are you talking about? You're an essential worker. No. Interview over. We're done. Bye, Andrés.
So, Andrés, I heard that you were invited to come to Eleusinia. Are you contemplating, is that ever a potential
sure.
for you to come?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that would be very good, I think. And I'm very interested.
Is there anything else that you wanted to mention and share that could have been to relevance to you that we didn't get to talk about?
Very briefly, I mean, like the other technologies that we're looking into. I mean, like we think like there's a way of preventing kidney stones. I mean, it's not exactly related, and it's not as interesting as DMT. It's a South American herb called Chanca Piedra. We think especially as a preventative, it might just like be able to reduce kidney stones by a huge margin, maybe tackle
there was
more than 50%
an analogy you used about that we spend more time having the pain and suffering of kidney stones than what was it?
Potentially like having surgery or something like that.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, and I mean, and for kidney stones, it is where you do get opioids and they do work a little bit, but
they work a lot better than for this neurological pain.
Yeah. But you don't want to go to the ER every time you get a kidney stone. So that's another one. And in terms of like neurotechnology, we are working on this combination device, which is light, sound, and body vibration. And it's like really cool because it puts you in kind of like a pretty psychedelic state of consciousness without like having to take anything. And it is very exciting. It is very exciting, I think, especially when it comes to its potential to help you process trauma and emotion. It's kind of it's kind of like combining like a really positive concert experience together with like a really positive like feeling heard by a friend, and like the emotional processing of those two things at once, but for internal issues that you may have, you may not even be able to label or describe them. But other than that, I would love to see your retreat grow and figure out how to scale it up so that many more people who suffer from these conditions can access these life-saving resources. So yeah, let me know if there's anything I can do. But I mean, essentially, I think at this point, like scaling up for you guys would be an amazing thing to work on. So
Thank you so
Well,
much.
once we convince people that you come to the retreat and you're going to go home with both of your kidneys, it's pretty smooth sailing after that. That they won't wake up in a bathtub full of ice cubes and be like, "Oh, where's my other kidney?" Um,
No, that happens on ketamine retreats, not on psilocybin.
oh, so we have to be specific about that. You just think you lost a kidney. That's it.
Yes.
So
Uh,
I did have a question for you, Andres. That was, well, since as far as I know, you don't personally have any connection with chronic pain. Am I correct with that?
I don't currently suffer from chronic pain, thankfully.
So, what is it about the state of your common man that has brought you towards this interest?
Yeah, I mean, it is a combination of, I mean, I would say like two things. I mean, and this is what I advocate for, kind of what spirituality could be. I mean, this is kind of how I think of it. Is a combination of oneness. I mean, which is, yeah, kind of this psychedelic insight that, okay, we're all connected, we're all part of the same field of consciousness, to put it poetically. And then the second element is valence realism, that like actually like experiences do feel good or bad, and there's like a scale for these, and it's not up to us, like you can't imagine it away. So when you combine those two things and you take them very seriously, in some sense you realize that, whoever has pain, it is kind of the collective pain of the field of consciousness. So it really blurs the boundaries, and it really doesn't matter if it's like my pain or your pain. Like, it is pain either way. And in that sense, yeah, it's kind of like, even from a very just pure rational point of view, is like, this is obviously the most important thing I could be working on. So that's how I think about it.
wow,
Amazing.
that is remarkable. Thank you so much. It's just been wonderful. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk with us. Is there other ways that people can follow your work? I know you have videos out there.
I would recommend watching my YouTube videos. I intend to put out a bunch more or less soon. So yeah, just look up my name, Andrés Gómez Emilsson, at YouTube, and then Qualia Research Institute.org, and follow me on Twitter for bad takes on consciousness and jokes. So yeah, this has been really wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you,
Oh, you're so
and for the
welcome.
work you're doing. It's yeah, God's work.